I'm joined by Patrick Arben, a partner in our dispute resolution team, who's going to discuss how to manage the end of a contractual relationship. Patrick, why is it so important to set out the termination provisions at the outset of the commercial relationship?
Well, I think exit and termination is probably the most neglected aspect of contract management, which is surprising really when one considers that it's an inevitability that at some stage your contract's going to come to an end, and sometimes sooner than you think, whether that be through early termination for convenience or perhaps even breach. And really, from my perspective, the most important thing is to manage your contract with termination in mind, because the benefits of that can be huge in terms of preserving your reputation, in terms of minimising cost, reducing risk, and ensuring a smooth transition to your new service provider.
How can the parties maximise a smooth transition however the contract ends?
I think first and foremost it's important to ensure that your contract allows for and provides for the parties to agree an exit plan, and in those circumstances it's equally important to actually make sure that you agree and negotiate that exit plan. All too often that's an area of contract management that gets ignored or neglected. Often as well the parties will agree an exit plan, but it will be very high level and generic, and actually I think it's very important to ensure that that exit plan is comprehensive and includes all the key elements of exit assistance that you as a customer are going to require. That will depend on the size and shape and nature of your contract, but it's going to include things like the transfer of employees and TUPE obligations, the management of third-party contracts, how are they going to be transferred or novated, and it's going to include things like the transmission of data as well. Also, it's important to think about whether your exit plan is sufficiently clear and concise that it could be, if necessary, enforced by the courts, if you have to go to the court to ask for assistance in getting those exit obligations enforced. And key really to all of this is don't leave the negotiation of your exit plan until you've served your notice of termination. By then it's really too late, because essentially what you're doing during your notice period is you're in a negotiation phase when you should be in an implementation phase.
Do you have any insights into how to get the notices of termination right?
I think the first thing that you should consider is you should ensure as a customer that you are minimising your dependency on the supplier in the run-up to serving that notice of termination. It's suboptimal really if you're about to embark on a major change control project 2 or 3 weeks before you serve your notice, because essentially what's going to happen is you're going to be asking your service provider not only to implement a significant change to the contract, also going to be asking your service provider to allow for business as usual and also to engage in exit assistance. Secondly, I think it's important to make sure that you allow sufficient time in your notice of termination to allow exit activities to be completed. In circumstances where you have produced a resource-based plan which has a number of key deliverables and activities, you need to make sure that where you have discretion, you should be giving sufficient notice to allow all of those activities to be undertaken. And thirdly and finally, I think it's important to make sure that you comply with the notice provisions in the contract. So if the contract tells you you've got to serve that notice by first-class post or by hand, then make sure you do that. Don't rely on informal methods of service like email, because that notice may not be effective.
Having served notice of termination, what are the key risks during the exit period and how can they be mitigated?
Well, I think that firstly, if there's a lack of engagement between the supplier and the customer, that is going to certainly jeopardise the implementation of any exit plan. Parties need to meet frequently and early on in the process in order to kick things off and get the process started. Secondly, where there's uncertainty over roles and responsibilities for certain deliverables in terms of implementing that exit plan, that in turn can lead to delay, and any time spent arguing or in dispute over the implementation over an exit plan means you're cutting into the available time to implement that plan. Other common areas of risk are disputes and disagreements around exit costs, so who's going to be paying the service provider for exit assistance. Is that something which is incorporated into the contract, or is that a separate and discrete cost that should be paid for? And of course, the thorny issue of compensation for early termination. Many contracts contain a provision for the service provider to be compensated for any upfront investment in the contract which has not been recovered as a result of that contract terminating early. In terms of mitigating those risks, well, it's important obviously to have a structure and a process for maintaining engagement between exit teams. It's important to identify sticking points and risks early on. Don't park those risks. Make sure they're escalated as quickly as possible to key decision makers so that those risks can be hopefully mitigated and overcome. And in circumstances where they can't, it's important, I think, to ensure that where you're going to use an alternative dispute resolution process to try and resolve any disputes on exit, that you perhaps either agree in your exit plan or as a part of your contract a truncated dispute resolution process which can allow you to escalate a dispute quickly and avoid a lengthy delay which of course again will eat into your allowable time to implement that exit plan.
How should the parties approach resolving any disputes which do arise during the notice period?
I think the first question to ask is the dispute key to ensuring a smooth transition of the service? If the dispute is one which is an ancillary issue, for example a dispute over service charges or unpaid invoices, then consider whether it's possible to either deal with that dispute in parallel to your exit activities or to park the dispute until after the exit process is completed and deal with it then. If that's not possible, or if the dispute is absolutely key to being resolved in order for exit to happen, then obviously consider making sure that you escalate that dispute as quickly as you can. Take it through a truncated alternative dispute resolution procedure if one can be agreed and if one's available. But if it's impossible to resolve that dispute, then of course you're going to be looking very much as a last resort to the courts for perhaps emergency injunctive relief, either perhaps for a declaration as to the meaning of the contract where there's a dispute or disagreement as to what the parties' respective obligations are on exit, or even potentially an application for specific performance to compel, if you're a customer, to compel the service provider to perform certain key exit activities which are key to or which are vital in order for the exit process to complete.
And finally, do you have any key points for in-house counsel to take away?
First and foremost, to manage your contract with exit in mind. Make sure that you have an up-to-date and comprehensive exit plan in place well before you ever need to rely upon it. I think you should plan your notice of termination to ensure that you allow sufficient time for exit activities to be undertaken. I think it's important that you should engage early during the exit process with the respective teams so that any problems or issues can be identified and escalated quickly. Deal with those disputes either in parallel or park them until after the exit process has been completed. Injunctions are very much a last resort, but they are available, and there is assistance from the court available as very much a last resort.
Patrick Arben, thank you very much.